that you are all, as I am, very concerned about the events of the last few weeks and months, I'm going to just make some remarks about those events and what we might learn from them. I'm coming from London, and also, as it happens, also from Jerusalem, where I spend a very great deal of my time these days. But people across the West, from across the political spectrum, and from all religious denominations and none, have been really appalled and alarmed by the recent terrible events in the very heart of Europe. And I know you had an event here, the Lindt Cafe siege, but it's the events in the heart of Europe which have really shocked Europe itself. First, there were the Paris atrocities by Islamist terrorists, the slaughter of the cartoonists and editors of the Charlie Hebdo magazine, and then at the kosher grocery store with a further attempted attack on the Jewish school, which was in fact foiled, but in the course of which I think a police officer lost his or her life. I can't recall whether it was a man or a woman. And then a few weeks ago, there was almost a kind of mirror event, a mirror of these events in Denmark, when a meeting in a Copenhagen cafe, which had been called to discuss specifically the threats to freedom of speech, was in turn attacked by a Muslim terrorist who murdered one participant at that meeting, and that was immediately followed by his making a beeline for the synagogue in Copenhagen, where he murdered a volunteer security guard from the congregation, and I'm sure set out to murder many more. So these were two mirror events where, first of all, people were attacked because they had insulted Islam, and then they were attacked simply because they were Jews. Now, in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, European Jews have been put on alert. In Britain, where every Jewish communal event is already guarded, they've been guarded for years. They have been put on alert by security officials that they are at particular intensified risk. It's very frightening in these circumstances to be a Jew in Europe. We're being told by the security establishment it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. There could be another Lindt Cafe, there could be another Paris, there could be another Copenhagen, there could be another beheading in the street. We had a near beheading of an off-duty soldier in the street. There could be another Mumbai, a multi-target attack. And what the security officials are telling us is we can't do anything really to stop this. We are intercepting plots all the time, we're arresting people all the time, but we can't stop this, it's too big. And with the Jews of Britain and elsewhere in Europe, knowing they are particular targets, it is extremely frightening to be a Jew in Europe. Now, the shock that people have had about all this in Europe is extremely real, because attacks associated with the Arab world are now occurring at the very heart of Europe. And even more than that, there is a particular shock when it comes to the attacks on Jews, because Europe has a particular sensitivity about the Jews in Europe, and here we have a situation where attacks on Jews are happening again in Europe, which was the graveyard of the Jewish people in the Holocaust, and which once again is conspicuously failing to protect its Jews. So across the board there is a lot of shock and a lot of concern about this. Yet, even so, I think there is still a widespread failure to acknowledge the full nature of what is happening. As I've said, Europe is discovering to its horror that once again Jews are being made victims in its midst, and once again it is powerless to protect them. It's asking itself, how can this possibly be happening now, in our anti-racist, politically correct societies in which we have done everything we can to expunge prejudice and bigotry from our societies? First, there were the French atrocities, now Copenhagen. And what this has forced into the public domain, what has been forced into public attention, it's what has never ever been talked about, which is the Muslim victimization of Jews. This has never ever been mentioned before. Now, in the Jewish world, I am being asked the whole time, is it 1933 all over again? Is it time for the Jews of Europe to pack up and leave? Well, in France, they are already leaving in great number and have been for many years. The situation, however, in Europe is not homogeneous. It's different in different countries. In France, the Jews there have felt at great physical risk for many years. There have been many, many attacks. There have been murders. You will remember the terrible story of the young Parisian man Ilan Halimi, who was kidnapped and tortured and murdered. This has been going on for years, and in Jerusalem, where I live much of the time, you hear French all the time, and the French people are coming in very large numbers, and after the Paris atrocities of a few months ago, more of them are coming in. So that's France. In Britain, it's a very different situation. In Britain, certainly attacks have gone up, but nothing like the violence that has been experienced in France. And in Britain, there's always been a very ambiguous attitude to Israel, in the sense that British Jews don't really identify with Israel in the way that so many of you do. They're very, very concerned. They've always been concerned, British Jews, that if you are a British Jew and you support Israel, you are basically immediately suspect. You are basically immediately accused of dual loyalty. You're not regarded as a proper Brit. And this is true. This is indeed the attitude in Britain. But it's meant that the British Jews have always kept their heads down when it comes to Israel and when it comes to their Jewishness. Now, if you are that kind of Jew, if you live in a community bubble, you live in a Jewish area, and your social circle is drawn from Jews, and you don't actually much think about Israel because it's not really for you, and you're a bit embarrassed about it anyway, and you kind of tune it out, so you don't hear or read all the stuff that's being said about Israel. It doesn't even get to you. So then you don't feel there is a problem. You can genuinely say, I have not got a problem here as a British Jew. So there are two sorts of Jews now in Britain. There are the Jews who say, there is an increasing problem, I feel very concerned, I feel very uncomfortable, and there are the British Jews who say, I don't see a problem at all. So you can't generalise at all about this situation. So it's not the same as 1933 in my view. I think that one has to be extremely careful about making that kind of analogy, and the difference is very fundamental. In 1933, there was a state apparatus put behind the persecution of the Jews. What's happening now is that we may think that our governments in Britain or Europe are not doing what they should be doing to protect people and to fight this thing that they're up against. But that's not the same as the state putting itself behind this thing. On the contrary, the governments of Britain and Europe are horrified by Islamist terror. And so it's a different situation. However, given that, having said that it's a different situation, in my view, there is still a widespread denial of what we are actually up against. A widespread denial of the nature of this threat, which is being faced not just by Jews, but by the whole of the free world. And also, virtually no realization of the way the animus against Israel is an aspect of this same phenomenon of the Islamist threat against the West, against the free world, and how that animus has helped fuel it. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So in other words, there is genuine horror, but very little, in my view, proper understanding. And that's illustrated by the change that's actually taken place. There is a genuine change, as I've said. People are suddenly talking about the fact that Jews have been attacked. They were attacked in France, and they were attacked in Copenhagen, and what's going on here? And suddenly people are talking about rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and indeed in Britain. It's the first time I can remember this topic actually being talked about in public. And it's not really surprising when you look at what's been going on. Figures produced by the Community Security Trust, which is the Jewish community organisation looking after the defence of the community, have shown that the number of anti-Jewish incidents last year, both physical and verbal attacks on British Jews, doubled and reached record levels. Jewish people have been directly abused in the street over this past year at the rate of more than one a day, particularly if they're wearing religious or traditional clothing or a Jewish school uniform. On the 18th of November, the very day that the synagogue in Jerusalem was attacked, you may recall, in Har Nof, and congregants were massacred in that synagogue by Palestinian attackers. On that very day, there happened to be a spike of 11 incidents, British incidents against British Jews in one day. I mean, you may think this is a small number, these are small numbers. Do bear in mind that out of a population of upwards of 60 million people in Britain, there are, at the last count in terms of the Jews who identify as Jews, something like 280,000. It's minute, it's very, very, very small. So, 11 incidents in one day is a lot. A rabbi driving through London reportedly had "slaughter the Jews" shouted at him in Arabic by a man running his finger across his throat in a cutting action. It's just the kind of thing that's going on. And there was a report in the last 2 or 3 weeks by the Parliamentary Committee on Anti-Semitism, which noted, quote, "a palpable concern, insecurity, loneliness and fear following the summer's rise in incidents and subsequent world events." The summer's rise in incidents was during the Gaza war. Subsequent world events were the events in Paris. So when the events in Paris happened, when the kosher supermarket, the Hyper Caché, was attacked, people in Britain suddenly kind of woke up to the fact that Jews are being attacked in France, and they thought, wonder what the Jews of Britain think. I mean, France isn't very far away, it's just across the English Channel, so let's go and ask the Jews of Britain what they think, and whether they're frightened that this thing that's happened in Paris might come to Britain. And so they asked them, and they were astounded by what they heard, because British Jews said, well, since you kindly have asked me this question, I have to say that really I am very concerned that my children and grandchildren are growing up in Britain, because I don't think that British Jews have a future in Britain anymore. And everybody went, what? Where did that come from? It came from nowhere, people said. You had people like the legendary, iconic, comic British actress Maureen Lipman, who you may or may not have heard of, who has said, I think she wrote it in a magazine article in the last few weeks, she's considering moving to Israel because of the climate of anti-Jewish feeling. I can't tell you the shock this produces. This is an iconic British actress in a country where Jews don't say, I'm thinking of moving to Israel. And she's saying she's thinking of moving to Israel because of anti-Jewish feeling, and everybody goes, where did that come from? And a recent survey found that nearly half of Britons, when given a list of some classic anti-Jewish stereotypical nasty things, like Jews are greedy, they all stick together, they are whatever it is, you all make them up. This list of horrible things about Jews was presented to ordinary Brits, and they were asked to say, which of these statements do you think any of these statements is true about Jews? And nearly half of those who were surveyed thought that at least one of these anti-Jewish sayings was definitely or probably true. So there's a lot of this swirling around. People are saying, how can it be that Jews in Britain feel uncomfortable? And I have to say that some of us have been feeling that way for many years. For example, there's a current toleration of remarks that simply would not have been tolerated when I was a child. If people had made this kind of remark, they would have been considered to be absolutely beyond the pale and to have been given no quarter at all. Remarks such as Jews controlling the media or controlling American foreign policy by funding American politics so that they control American foreign policy. Those remarks were made by the former Labour Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, in the last few months. He has said, Jews control American foreign policy because they give so much money to American political parties. I mean, and the point was that people didn't say, that is an appalling thing to say. and dump on him from a great height. Nobody even remarked on it. There it was in the paper. No one even noticed. It's part of the wallpaper in Britain at the moment. So there's that going on, and I have to say also that for many years now, British Jews have been living in such a state of siege that many British Jews don't even see it like that. I mean, as I said, every Jewish communal event is guarded. This is a fact of life. There are Jewish schools that look like fortresses, they're behind razor wire. There are Jewish school children being taught self-defense to protect themselves from attack in the street. This is considered it's just how it is now. We don't even think about it. We don't even think twice about it. We assume this is part of normal life. And yet, of course, it is completely abnormal. Yet now, for the first time I can remember, concern is being expressed about anti-Jewish feelings. So I think that's actually an advance. It's been an advance that's come about through terrible events, but it is an advance. People are beginning to talk about it. They are noticing. Suddenly, you get items on this phenomenon popping up on TV and on radio and in newspapers. You know, are our Jews frightened? There was a whole page in the Daily Telegraph devoted to a family from Manchester which has decided to up sticks as a family and move to Arizona. Don't ask me what's so wonderful about Arizona, but far be it for me to say that Arizona wouldn't be my first choice, but there you go. They are moving because they don't feel safe in Britain. A whole page in the Daily Telegraph. I have never seen that sort of coverage ever before. The government of Britain has let it know that it is extremely concerned. The Home Secretary, Theresa May, has said she never thought she'd see the day when British Jews thought they didn't have a future in Britain. And another cabinet minister has warned that, in his phrase, a creeping cultural acceptance of anti-Semitism is taking over in Britain. This is all good, because until very recently, anti-Semitism was the prejudice that dared not speak its name in Britain. You could not mention that word. You were told immediately you were hysterical, that it was an exaggeration, that you were trying to make them feel guilty, and above all, it was an attempt to show, if you said that the anti-Israel lunacy, the anti-Israel animus dominating public discussion of Israel, if you attempted to say that was grounded in anti-Jewishness, you were immediately told that you were waving the shroud of the Holocaust to sanitize Israel's crimes. Even though, in my view, the anti-Israel animus displays precisely the same characteristics as ancient anti-Jew attitudes, in that it is obsessive, it is based entirely on falsehoods, it holds Jews responsible for all the ills of the world, or Israel rather. It presents Israel in a kind of demonic sense as being a really sort of satanic conspiracy, full of people who deliberately kill Palestinian children. So these are all the characteristics of ancient Jew hatred to me. But in the past, whenever I would, or anybody else would say, there's a crossover here. It's not just criticism of Israel. This is something else. This is so disproportionate and so unreasonable that it reflects these unique characteristics of ancient Jew hatred. You were told you were waving the shroud of the Holocaust to sanitize the crimes of Israel. And so, because nobody could talk about anti-Semitism, nobody could talk about the anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. And that goes for the Jewish community in Britain as well. The Jewish community leadership has never, to my knowledge, talked about Muslim anti-Semitism. What concerns the Jewish community leadership in Britain, guess what their main concern might be in this matter? It's to fight Islamophobia. And since Islamophobia is the term which covers all criticism of the Muslim world, and since if you talk about Muslim anti-Semitism, you're told that you're Islamophobic, I mean, that kind of does your head in, because, you can't talk about one prejudice without being accused of having another prejudice, so it shuts down debate. So no one's ever talked about Muslim anti-Semitism. No one's ever talked about the fact that out of the Muslim world, in the Muslim world, you have this outpouring all the time of the most extraordinary Nazi-style demonizing images which present Jews as a satanic conspiracy. And that fuels Muslim hysteria, which in turn helps incite Muslims to violence and murder. But this is never talked about. So the wider society has ignored the persecution of Jews that has been going on in France, perpetrated by Muslims, and also in other countries, Netherlands, Sweden. It's ignored the fact that in Britain, Jews have increasingly been attacked, verbally and physically. And above all, it never saw how the attitudes towards Israel came from the same poisoned spring and were swelling the waters of anti-Jewish hatred in turn. The reporting of Israel being as malevolent as it is, it can't help but incite hatred of these people who are doing these terrible things like killing Palestinian children. So the reason why the attitudes to Israel have been so poisoned is broadly, it's not actually to do with Muslims, it's to do with the fact that the left-wing intelligentsia in Britain and in Europe has bought wholesale into the Palestinian rewriting of history, which I think was cooked up between Yasser Arafat and the Soviet Union, which rewrote what is basically a 100-year Arab war of extermination against Israel into an attempt by Israel to drive Palestinians out of land which people believe in total error belonged since time immemorial to the Palestinian Muslims. That's broadly what people in Britain believe to be the case. And there are various other reasons why this terrible malevolence towards Israel has taken hold. I think that in Britain and in Europe, there is a kind of pathology going on relative to the Holocaust. I think that the shadow of the Holocaust sits very heavily across Europe, including in Britain. This is the continent which presided over the genocide of the Jews. And I think the kind of collective guilt that Europe feels about this is so intolerable that they have to kind of wipe out completely the idea that Jews are victims. Jews cannot be victims again. And so it was very convenient when the Palestinians came along and painted Israelis like Ariel Sharon, and going back to the 1980s, as Nazis. Because if the Jews were Nazis in Israel, then it meant that Europe wasn't quite so guilty. So you have all of that going on. And so this is also part of the shock about Paris, about Copenhagen, about the fact that Jews feel unsafe, because it's unambiguous. These are Jews being attacked as Jews, nothing to do with Israel, and people can see that. And this is intolerable to them, because, again, Jews in Europe are becoming victims. That can't happen. So that's part of the shock that's going on. So attacks on Jews in Britain and in Europe have always spiked after any military action taken by Israel against the Palestinians. But people have never assumed that that is because of the way it is being reported. They've never understood or acknowledged that if you have malevolent reporting presenting Israel so falsely, you are going to incite hatred. On the contrary, people say, if there is a relationship between what's going on in Israel and attacks on Jews, it is because of what Israel is doing. It's Israel's fault that Jews are being attacked in Britain. And so last summer's Gaza war tested this theory to destruction, because we had really appalling pictures on television virtually every night, terribly distressing pictures of dead Palestinian babies and children, with the narrative, which was basically written as a script written by the Hamas, transmitted uncritically by the BBC, by Sky, which was that the vast majority of the people that the Israelis were killing in Gaza were civilians, and the majority of those civilians were children. Now, that was actually untrue, but if you have that night after night with these horrific pictures, then any person of conscience is going to be revolted by these dreadful people, the Israelis. And if you are Muslims, and you come from a society where this demonic picture of Jews is pouring out the whole time, then you're going to be incited to more than hatred. You're going to be incited to a kind of hysteria, and you're going to start taking matters into your own hands. And that is, in my view, what happened, and that's why attacks on Jews in Britain doubled. And so that was going on. You know, we had attacks on Jews going up. But something else happened, which was very interesting. You had the Gaza pictures, you had the Hamas narrative, you had the attacks on Jews. So much is obvious. But then what happened was that the people who were attacking Israel because of Gaza went a little bit too far. They're so brazen, so much, they have behaved over the years towards Israel with such malevolence and such malice, with such impunity, they've got away with it completely, that they went a little bit overboard last summer. And they did things which were unambiguously anti-Jew. For example, the Tricycle Film Theatre, the Tricycle Theatre, which is a fashionable little theatre in London and has hosted for many years the UK Jewish Film Festival, suddenly said, after the Gaza thing, we are not going to host the Jewish Film Festival anymore because the Jewish Film Festival has taken a small donation from the Israel Embassy. And everybody went, what? But it's the Jewish Film Festival. And the British Jews went, what? But it's our film festival and we are Jews. This is outrageous. I have to say the British Jewish community never turned a hair when the Edinburgh Film Festival or the Edinburgh Theatre Festival turns away, as it regularly does, Israeli artists because they come from, you know, apartheid-ridden Israel. That doesn't get any coverage. The British Jews don't notice that, and nobody turns a hair. When it's targeting the Jewish Film Festival, well, balloon goes up. And then anti-Gaza, anti-Israel demonstrators, mainly Muslim, demonstrating in the street against Gaza, lighted upon a very jolly jape indeed. They realised that they could go into a grocery store up and down the country. You know, there's the two big grocery chains, Sainsbury's and Tesco's. They have stores up and down the country. They would go into the grocery store and they would take all the kosher food off the chiller counters, off the chiller shelves and out of the freezers, and put it all into the wire baskets and then walk out. And this would trash the kosher food because by law, because of hygiene rules, the shop couldn't then put it all back onto the shelves because it had been taken out of the chillers and the freezers. So it was a way of wrecking kosher food. It was a way of targeting kosher food sales and kosher food supplies. And everybody went, what? But this is Jewish food. It's nothing to do with Israel. So for the first time, people could see that Jews were being targeted. And then we had the Paris attack, and people went, oh my goodness, Jews are being killed. Not just their food is being trashed, not just their film festival, they're actually being murdered. And so people then started talking about all of this. And then people said, well, so now we have a new situation. We've had these terrible attacks in Europe. We've had the onslaught on freedom of speech with Charlie Hebdo. We've had the onslaught on Jews as Jews. This is intolerable. We cannot have this. And so other people said, so maybe now we have a tipping point. Maybe now Europe is going to wake up properly. Maybe now Europe is going to get its act together. Maybe now Europe is going to take action it should take to protect people against this threat. Was Paris a tipping point, people asked. And people also asked, while they were thinking about whether Paris was a tipping point, they also said, but do you think Europe is actually now, finished? Is it all over for Europe? And do you think that possibly the Jews of Europe should now all get up and leave and go to Israel? So these are three questions. Was Paris a tipping point? Is Europe finished? Is it time for Europe's Jews to go? And the short answer, was Paris a tipping point? No. Is Europe finished? Who knows? And is it time for Europe's Jews to go? Yes and no. And I just want to take the remainder of my time just to go through those 3 points as briefly as I can. It's not a tipping point because when it comes to France, the French government means well, but the problem is probably too big. It's simply powerless to protect its Jews, and they know that. That's why they're upping and going to Israel and indeed to other countries too. And the real reason why it's not a tipping point is that since Paris, we have seen politicians going to enormous lengths to avoid saying that Islam or the Islamic world or Muslims present any problem at all. They all linked hands and walked down the street of Paris and they said, we will never surrender, we will defend liberty. And then they said immediately, this has got nothing to do with religion. Hollande said this has got nothing to do with Islam. Mr. Cameron, Prime Minister of Great Britain, said after the near decapitation of the off-duty soldier Lee Rigby on the streets of London by 2 Muslim converts who had got machetes, meat cleavers, and more or less cut his head off, and stood there brandishing their meat cleavers, quoting the Quran, Mr. Cameron said, there is nothing in Islam that justifies acts of terror. The Jordanian pilot we saw in horror was burned alive in the cage by Islamic State. After that, the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office said, ISIS is not Islam. It is extremism hiding under the banner of religion to carry out barbaric, appalling atrocities against Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And Mr. Cameron, when Islamic State, ISIS, started beheading people, Mr. Cameron said, there is no religion that can condone this. This is nothing to do with religion. This is just barbarism. Well, you know, where have all these people been living all these years? Remember Daniel Pearl and many other Americans who were beheaded by Al-Qaeda? People don't even know. In Africa, Christians are being burned alive in churches regularly. No one reports it, no one knows. So what's all this business about Islamic State being so incomprehensible? Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Hamas, they use the same kind of techniques, the same kind of barbarism. They quote the same religious precepts, which all happen to come from the same religion. And this is just a matter of coincidence, apparently. It's extremism masquerading as religion. Well, this seems to me to be putting your head in the sand to the most extraordinary degree. And it's for various reasons. We can all understand why some of these reasons are that politicians behaving in this way. They fear domestic unrest. In Britain, they're very, very frightened. If they talk about Islam, they will get Muslim riots, and they will also get anti-Muslim riots. Either way, you don't talk about it because you produce social disorder. So there are reasons like that to do with sort of self-preservation, fear, whatever you like to call it. But there's also a couple of misapprehensions. People in the West, Western governments, have a number of misapprehensions. First of all, they believe that everyone in the world is like them. People in the West are stupendously arrogant. They think that they are the flower and the acme of humanity, and everyone is like them. That means that everyone in the world is governed by reason, and everyone in the world is governed by a sense of their own self-interest. So the British say, we know how to deal with revolting natives. You set one group against the other. Easy peasy, because ultimately, whatever they say, they believe, ultimately, they're all in it for themselves. So you just have to find a way of making them realize that if they do X or Y, it will be good for them. They don't understand that there are people in the world who believe they are God's warriors. They believe they are doing the divine work of the Almighty, and that the text is written for them in the religious scriptures that they call the Quran. And the West doesn't believe that. That's the first thing it doesn't believe. And the second thing it doesn't believe, it doesn't understand, is that the Arab and Muslim world operates on the basis of if you don't show extreme strength, you are weak. So the Brits and the Europeans believe we're all reasonable people. We have an argument with someone. The way to resolve the argument is to sit down around a table. I compromise with you, you compromise with me, I give to you, you give to me, I extend the hand of friendship to you, and we find common ground and we all move forward together. That's how civilized people behave. What they don't understand is that any kind of rapprochement with people whose agenda is non-negotiable, because it is the word of God, and they are God's warriors. It's a non-negotiable agenda. So if the other side is giving compromise, negotiation, hand of friendship, it's seen as a sign of weakness, and that galvanizes them to say, look, we're almost there. All we've got to do is redouble our efforts. All we've got to do is murder some more people. All we've got to do is shut down some more cartoonists or whatever it is, and we'll win. And so it galvanizes recruitment to these terrible causes. And these are the things that Britain and Europe just doesn't understand. So now we have a situation where in Britain there are untold thousands, we're told, untold thousands of young British Muslims, boys and girls, who are joining ISIS. Why are they joining ISIS? A number of reasons, but the main reason is that it's there. It's in northern Iraq, it has set up a government, it's administering services, it's declared a caliphate. And a certain type of susceptible young Muslim says, my goodness, we never thought we'd see this on a caliphate, that's fantastic. Let's join up and we can have more caliphates. Look, they're talking about moving into Italy now. They're talking about conquering Rome. How wonderful that would be, but they've done it already in Iraq, so we're nearly there. So they're joining. So the way you stop the radicalization is you have to destroy ISIS completely in Iraq. Now, our governments are just not doing that. I mean, I think, your Prime Minister was pretty gung-ho the other day when he was reportedly thinking about moving into Ukraine, was it, or somewhere. But I mean, you can understand his point of view. Someone's got to do something here, because otherwise bad people are going to get the wrong impression, or rather the right impression, that the West is open there for the taking, and it will galvanize more people to attack. But our government in Britain is absolutely baffled by these young people joining ISIS. It can't understand it. These are young British Muslims, born and bred in Britain. Why would they go and join up? Simply because they see the thing that makes them join up is these terrible videos, the beheadings, the burnings. They're joining up. How to explain this? So the government says, well, we think that young people are being drawn by the need to have excitement in their lives. We think that some of them, unfortunately, quite like violence, and we think it's a kind of misplaced idealism. I think this is, bizarre. Okay, all these things are true to a point, but it hardly accounts. Excitement can hardly account. A desire for excitement can hardly account for what is basically an outbreak of mass psychopathy. That's what we're dealing with here. And so I would suggest a more likely explanation is not to say, well, it's got nothing to do with religion, and so it's a desire for excitement in their lives. I would say, isn't it more straightforward and more obvious to say the source is religious fanaticism? We know what religious fanaticism does. We've seen it over the centuries. The barbarism that we see now playing out before us. It was there in the Middle Ages. Christianity did all these terrible things. Religion does that to people. When people are religious fanatics, that's what happens. And this is religious fanaticism with a particular appeal to a particular kind of young person. Lost, rootless, stranded between cultures. And this is the real unsayable, you do realise you're hearing a whole list of unsayables here, a particular religion which validates the most extreme violence by giving it an ostensibly noble aim. Because if you look at the Quran, it says what you do with unbelievers is you crucify them. It says it. So here you have a situation where you have a religious text which tells people that if they go and crucify somebody, they're doing God's work. I mean, this is what we're dealing with. We can't say this because it's got nothing to do with religion. So in Britain and in Europe, our governments haven't got a clue how to stop this terrible radicalization that's going on because they won't even identify the source, let alone deal with it at the source. And as I've said, they don't understand these different premises about strength and weakness. They don't understand this idea that negotiation and compromise are seen as weakness. They won't join up the dots. And They won't see that the Arab war against Israel is what it is. It's not a war of, it's not a conflict over land boundaries, it's a war of extermination, and they won't accept that the driver of this war of extermination is theological Jew hatred in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, which means that to that world, Jews cannot rule in any country where Muslims have been in occupation. And they don't understand, because they don't report the Muslim Jew hatred that is driving the Muslim world, they don't understand something even more important. They don't understand the Jew hatred that drives Muslims to kill Jews. That's bad enough. But they don't understand that that Jew hatred is driving Muslims to kill them. And this is how it works. The Islamists, the people who redefined, who are behind what we know as Islamism, which is the desire basically to impose Islam on the not Islamic enough and not Islamic world, they believed that the great threat that had to be defeated, the great threat to Islam, was modernity. They understood that modernity would destroy Islam. Okay? It would destroy the way women were treated. It would destroy Islam. So they set out to destroy modernity, and of course they set out to destroy America, because America is the principal carrier of modernity. But what people don't understand is that they identified Jews as the creators of modernity. Now, I'm sure that you all know backwards the Hamas Charter. I'm sure you all read it to yourselves every night. You will therefore know that this is there in terms in the Hamas Charter. Hamas Charter says, in a particularly mad paragraph, the Jews are behind everything to do with the modern world. The Jews were behind everything from the French Revolution onwards. The Jews were behind the French Revolution. The Jews are behind capitalism. The Jews are behind communism. The Jews are behind sociology. The Jews are behind the League of Nations. The Jews are behind the United Nations. The Jews are behind everything to do with modernity. Oh, and they're behind the First World War as well. And consequently, if you think that modernity has to be eradicated because otherwise it's going to destroy Islam, then you also destroy the people who are behind modernity. And that is a very important reason why the Jews are the target, and also why America is the target, because of course America is run by the Jews, because the Jews created modernity, and America is the fount of capitalism and modernity, and so it's all to do with the Jews, unfortunately, and consequently, because the West does not even accept, doesn't even tell itself there is this Jew hatred going on in the Muslim world, it hasn't got a clue that it's a threat not just to Jews, but to themselves. So how bad is the situation for European Jews? And I'm bringing my remarks to a close. Well, as I've said, people are starting to join the dots, and that's a good thing. People are starting to talk about Jew hatred in Britain and Europe, and that's a good thing because they weren't talking about it before. And people also are looking at Islamic State and thinking, you know what? Maybe it's not all the Jews' fault. Maybe it's not all Israel's fault. Maybe there's something else going on here, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So there is some cause for optimism in that people are beginning to join up some of the dots and beginning to arrive at a more realistic understanding of what's going on here. In Britain, they're also thinking, and they're also saying this, I can hear them saying it, they're saying, oh, are these Jews, I mean, you know, our Jews are thinking of going. I mean, that's terrible, because, you know, we're going to lose the Jews, and instead, we're going to get Muslims. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be very shocked to hear this, in Britain, they don't think that's much of a bargain. So these are all plus points, because it means that people are kind of inching along towards a more realistic position. But they don't understand, this business about Jews is critical. They don't understand that Jew hatred is not only a risk to Jews, and it's not only that it's a risk to themselves. They don't understand that Jew hatred is a prejudice unlike any other prejudice. And I don't just mean that it has unique properties, because it does have unique properties, which means that it's not a prejudice like any other, it's a particularly murderous point of view, and it's a particularly deranged point of view. But I also think this, that anti-Jewish attitudes lie at the very heart of the Western society's death wish. If you look at the West, you look at a situation where Western civilization, Western culture is fundamentally based on Jewish precepts. Okay, Christianity is the foundational creed, but Christianity is founded on the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible embodies or gave the world the Mosaic codes of morality which underpin the West. That's where we get in the West the idea that we're all equal in the sight of God. That's where we get in the West the idea that we should actually form societies based on the idea that we put other people's interests before our own. These are all Jewish precepts, excuse me. So you have a situation in the West, particularly Europe and particularly Britain, which is the brand leader of all this, in which for a variety of reasons, those societies, Britain in particular, have basically taken a sledgehammer to the values underpinning the West. Why? Because the idea that anyone or anything or any authority should put a kind of chain on my appetites in the interest of anybody else is not something I wish to have anymore. Instead, I myself am the author of my own moral story. What is right for me is what is right. I live my own life in the way that I want to. No one has the right to tell me that my lifestyle is any worse than any other, and so on and so forth. In other words, the West has basically chucked out, or is chucking out, these moral codes that put other people's interests first, and instead has put self-interest first. In other words, it's taken a sledgehammer to the Mosaic Law. It's taken a sledgehammer to precepts which, it may not even know it, but they are, in fact, Jewish precepts. And it's outlawed what it calls judgmentalism. Now, judgmentalism is the essence of morality. If I don't make a judgment that your behaviour stinks because you are being horrible to somebody else, well, then there's no morality. But we've outlawed judgmentalism, which is the essence of moral responsibility. Now, one of the consequences of outlawing judgmentalism is that we've created a kind of untouchable victim class. We have said that there are people who are the victims of us. They can never be responsible for their actions because they're historic victims of us. The people in the developing world, black and brown people in the developing world, ethnic minorities or minorities of any kind in our own society are victims of us, the majority. And therefore, if they do bad things, it's not their fault, it's our fault. It's our fault because we've made them victims. We cannot expect them to behave well because we have ground them over the years. So we've created an untouchable victim class which can do no wrong. And hence we are ultra-sensitive towards Muslim feelings, and that's why we can't discuss Islamic extremism, or we call it Islamophobia, because we can't express any kind of criticism of them, because they basically belong to the class which is a victim of us. And so we have tied ourselves up in knots here. We have told ourselves untruths about Israel and about Jews. It means that we cannot see the truth about Islam. And another example of the confusion in Britain, a recent survey showed that the British have more negative attitudes about Israel than they do about Iran. Just think about that. And I know from my personal anecdotal experience, people in Britain are very, very, very worried about Iran. You know what they're worried about? They're not worried that Iran's going to get the bomb. They're really worried. They have sleepless nights about Iran. What are they worried about? They're worried that Israel or America may attack Iran. Because if that happens, then bad things will happen. Right? Now, this is a completely backwards way of thinking. So we have a mood of appeasement, I would suggest rooted in a kind of national or civilizational demoralization. A sense that Europe is on its way out. It's hollowed itself out. It no longer knows what it believes in anymore. It's got rid of the underpinning moral virtues or values that it once had. It doesn't know what it stands for anymore. It's not prepared to fight and die for those things. And therefore the question is Europe finished? Well, it depends whether or not it is going to be prepared to fight for a civilization that it's almost completely forgotten what it is. And nobody can really tell that. But there are signs that it's not prepared to give it all up. You look at what's happening in Europe, it's not necessarily very pleasant. We see the rise of what are considered to be nationalist or more extreme parties. Marine Le Pen in France is poised to take advantage of all these convulsions. Worse parties in other countries in Europe and also just nationalist parties that don't want to lose European civilization. And it may well be that Europe is actually going to fight for values that it's almost completely forgotten, in which case, I have to say, I don't think that's a very reassuring prospect either. I mean, there are two unreassuring prospects. One is that Europe's going to say, well, you know what, it was nice while it lasted. Modernity, it was really nice, and liberal society was fine, it had its virtues. But now, it's all too difficult, and the cost of trying to defend that is just too great. And so I'm just going to sort of sit at home and play with my children, look after my garden, and just sort of hope that everything goes away. And that's how society goes off the edge of the cliff. It's possible. It's possible. Or people are going to say, my goodness, we didn't even know we were on a cliff, and now we're almost off the edge of it, and we're not going to go over that, thank you, and we're going to fight. In which case it's going to be bloody. There's going to be increasing social disorder, fighting, literal fighting, metaphorical fighting, and what frightens me is that the Jews of Europe are going to be in the middle, and they're going to be scapegoated, as Jews have often and always been, by both sides, who have all turned on the most vulnerable minority. That's what frightens me about the future for the Jews of Europe. And so we find, so my final conclusion is that may happen. Is it time for the Jews of Europe to leave? One can't possibly say that. It depends entirely on how these communities of Jews in Europe perceive their immediate situation and how it's going to develop, and it's for them to make a decision based on their own self-interest. Whether or not Europe itself is going to survive and therefore protect them and protect everybody else depends, as I say, on whether Europe is going to basically go off the edge of the cliff or whether it's going to make a fight. And this is where people like yourselves in Australia, and I would say also in Canada, are, I think, very important. I mean, I look at your Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, whatever you think of him and his present difficulties, he's a leader that stands up for what he believes and is not frightened of being unpopular. And Stephen Harper. These are Prime Ministers who are, whatever else you think of them, they are standing up for Israel in the face of extreme prejudice, which is very, very unusual. I look to people like that to help bring Europe out of the difficulty that it's in. Will it come out of the difficulty? I think it depends very much on the pain level. If we get many more attacks in Europe, then I think people are going to continue to move in a more sensible direction. It's a terrible price to pay. It's a terrible thing to say, and it's a terrible price to pay. But I'm afraid that it's going to take that to move Europe along. And so it's a rather uncertain message, or rather uncertain conclusion that I leave you with. But what I do know for a fact, for a certainty, is that if we are all going to really defend the West against the various attacks that are increasing against it, then it is up to all of us to do what we can to stand up and speak the truth as we see it in as loud and clear a fashion as possible. So thank you very much for allowing me the chance to do this.